new types of identities for themselves, when people are thinking about new ways to give respect to other people in their communities. There's a lot of things that we take for granted when we just have regular social interactions. And I think that this training can be helpful because it helps you contextualize your own experience with some of the things that other people might be experiencing as well. So hopefully you find it useful. I like to keep things relatively informal. So if you all have any questions for me, please feel free to share that in the chat, or you can interrupt me. I'll try to monitor everything. Holly, if you don't mind keeping an eye on the chat box, if you see there's a question in there that I haven't addressed recently, if you could just stop me, and I'll try to answer it as quickly and as efficaciously as possible. But hopefully you all can see my screen now. This presentation is just called Unconscious Bias 101 or Implicit Bias 101. We're going to get into some definitions in just a little bit. But the idea is that we're going to go over a few different aspects of unconscious bias or implicit bias. So the first thing is I'm going to offer an introduction. We're going to sort of understand what the terms are when we say implicit bias. We're going to talk about what bias is and how it relates to our unconscious brain. Then we're going to delve deeper into what unconscious bias can look like at the service side or at our work, or in a school setting or something like that. And then finally, we're going to discuss ways to mitigate bias, so ways to lessen the impact of bias in the world around us. So hopefully it's pretty straightforward. I'm going to try to use some videos and some humorous real world examples, so that way it's not all completely dry and academic. But there's a few reasons that we have for discussing these things. The first one is that we discuss implicit bias or unconscious bias because it's really important to AmeriCorps. It's really important to serve Kentucky, and it's really important to make sure that you all can move through the world in a way where you're aware of yourselves and you're aware of the impacts that you might be having in social surroundings. So the first thing is that Serve Kentucky provides oversight for all the different AmeriCorps programs throughout the state of Kentucky. Homes for All is just one of 23 AmeriCorps programs, and we also have some planning grants for 3 additional AmeriCorps programs. So there's a lot of different parts and pieces that go into the AmeriCorps family. In addition to that, we also have federal AmeriCorps programs that are deployed to Kentucky pretty frequently, from the NCCC or National Direct programs, all sorts of different people, as well as Senior Corps. So we have a lot of different types of AmeriCorps programs that are around. And consequently, you all have a lot of impact in communities throughout Kentucky. They can be in schools or educational settings. They can be in homeless shelters. They can be at parks and wilderness areas, all sorts of different places. And so we want to make sure that as you're moving through the world, as you're interacting with all these different types of people, that you're being good representatives of AmeriCorps, and that you're also having a positive experience while you're going through that situation. We also want to encourage volunteerism in all sorts of different forms, and we need to recognize that there's a way that sometimes the lived experience that we bring to different situations can impact these first 2 things. It can impact the oversight that we have when we're talking about running successful AmeriCorps programs, but it can also impact the way that volunteerism is encouraged or discouraged based on how we interact with other people. So at the end of the day, the reason why we're doing this is because we want you all to have a good experience, and we want to make sure that we're promoting service, community and economic development, and human well-being as we do our AmeriCorps service. So some of the objectives that we're going to talk about today are understanding bias and how that relates to our commitment to diversity and inclusion. Understanding that bias is not necessarily a negative thing. It's actually just a natural and normal function of the human brain. But we want to understand that bias impacts human relationships, and it changes the way that we interface with other people. So we need to be aware of that. And then finally, we want to realize the different cognitive steps that go into this process and make sure that we have some techniques at our disposal to lessen the impact of our unconscious bias when we're interacting with different types of people. So in order to be really successful as we're going through this situation, the course should take about 90 minutes, give or take. It depends on how much you all participate, how many questions we get. And I can slow down and go over some more details, or I can kind of breeze through it a little bit more quickly if we're running out of time. But I want you all to pay attention. I want you all to participate fully. That means if we're asking questions, hopefully you feel uncomfortable unmuting your microphones and sharing, or you can type it into the chat box. We want you to manage distractions whenever possible. This is important stuff, so it's helpful if you're not checking your email or you're on your phone. And also take responsibility for your learning, and pay attention to how you respond to different prompts in different situations. If you have something that you think is relevant that you'd like to share, I hope you feel comfortable doing that. I'd like to think that everything that we say over the course of this training will be kept in confidence. So it's kind of like what we call the Las Vegas rules. Whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Whatever happens during the training, we can keep it here in the training. But part of that is just about being sensitive and aware that other people might have had different lived experiences than our own. And likewise, if you hear somebody say something that seems really tone deaf or it seems really out of touch, I know our immediate inclination is to judge them or to say, like, this person doesn't know what they're talking about, or, that's not what I've experienced. But hopefully you can be compassionate if you hear somebody say something, and just assume for a little bit that we're all operating from a place of good faith, and we're just trying to work through this process together. So does anybody have any questions for me before we start?
Becky, it looks like you raised your hand. Hey, Becky, do you have a question? I see you raised your hand.
That's okay. We can come back if need be. But like I said, feel free to unmute yourself. You can interrupt me, or you can type stuff in the chat box, and hopefully we can get to any concerns you have. So we're going to watch a video. This is kind of humorous, but this is based on a real-world sociological experiment. So what I want you to do is pay attention to this video, and I'm going to turn my sound up. If it's too loud, Holly, just let me know, and I'll drop it down a little bit. But I want you to pay attention to what's going on in the video, and then we're going to kind of debrief about it afterwards. All right. So obviously that's meant to be kind of humorous, but let's debrief. What happens when we're watching this video? So, a few different couples are going to the movies. They go to watch what's happening, and then they walk into a theater, and what? Then anybody want to share what they saw?
Name is Kevin. It was full of men. They was intimidated,
Yeah.
But you had a couple of couples that they they had a lot of courage. They still sit down. You know what I mean? They still like, I'm coming in. I paid my fare, my money, and I'm gonna watch this movie regardless who's in there. You know? Yeah.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, so a few different people came in. They had different types of reactions. Some people come in and they're kind of intimidated. They may be a little freaked out because you see a bunch of dudes in the audience. And what did they look like? What did the people in the audience look like?
Probably some bikers.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Like
bikers. Why do they look like bikers?
Unconscious bias, the leather, tattoos, beards, you know.
Yeah, that's exactly right, LaDonna. So people walk into this theater, they see the whole theater is full with guys who look like bikers. You know, there are a lot of shaved heads, tattoos, leather vests, that sort of thing. And what's our association with bikers? Are bikers really friendly, easygoing people? Are they law abiding? Are they nice? You know? And it could be different for different people. Like Kevin was saying, some of those folks go in and they're just like, well, I paid for my ticket, so I'm just going to go find a seat or whatever. And if you notice, in some situations, people are like, well, I want to stay away from this. There's one where a guy is grabbing his partner's arm and he's like, let's not go in there. And then there's some where the women are like, well, I don't want to go in there. It's different for different situations. And of course, that could be based on your own experience. So what happens if you're friendly with a bunch of bikers? What do you do if your uncle is a biker or your aunt is a biker or something like that? You might have positive associations with it. So based on your experience, you might be seeing different things in the room than somebody else. But it's not always about the people. What's another reason that somebody might look at that theater and say, I'm not going to go in there. This isn't for me. Can anybody think of another reason why you would look at that same scenario and say, I'm not going to go in there, but it's not because of what the people look like?
It could definitely be because of how crowded the movie theater is, regardless of who's in there. People who are more introverted, people who need more physical space for a variety of physical and psychological reasons, could walk into that movie theater and think, that is many too many people, and I'm turning around now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a really good example. So it could be nothing to do with the type of people in there, but maybe you don't want to crawl over 10 folks to get to the middle of the movie. Maybe you want to sit on the aisle. What if you're in a wheelchair? What if you're the kind of person who just likes having a little bit of space and you've been interacting with people all day and the idea of going and sitting in the middle of a crowd doesn't seem relaxing at all? What if you're neuroatypical and you have an anxiety disorder? There's any number of reasons that don't have to do with the type of people in there, but it's the fact that there are a lot of people in there. Yeah, Caitlin?
I was going to say that, this is kind of similar to what you just said, but this is more specific to the pandemic. Like, I'm still pretty, like, if I see a room that's really crowded, it still kind of makes me uncomfortable. So I try to stick to places that I know, like, have, like, spaced out dining or, like, limit the capacity of people. So that's what I thought of when I looked at the movie theater. I was like, wow, this is really full. I do not want people sitting next to me in a pandemic.
Yeah, that's a great example. So even though this commercial is a couple years old, I think we've all gone through enough of COVID where we're like, oh my gosh, a big room of people who don't have masks on. This is like slightly disconcerting, So, and again, that's because you're coming from a place where you're trying to be careful. You wear a mask presumably when you're out in public, and you don't necessarily feel comfortable being in a group of people where you don't necessarily know if they've been tested or not. So anyway, the point is, there's all these different valid reasons for why somebody could go to a room like that and say, this isn't for me. Just like there's a number of reasons why somebody could go in and say, great, this looks awesome. This looks like exactly what I was looking for. And the idea is that this is actually based on a real experiment that was conducted, I believe, in Belgium. It was either Belgium or the Netherlands. And it was about how people interact with folks in crowded spaces. And the funny thing about this is that all those people in the audience are actors. You know, some of them in real life may have shaved heads or they may have tattoos, but for the most part, they were dressed up to look that way for the commercial. So they had their heads shaved, had a lot of fake tattoos, and you know, they even conducted a different version of the experiment where they had like 173 people dressed up like business executives, you know, so they're wearing like suits and like full dresses and, you know, makeup and things like that. And people got kind of freaked out in that scenario too. So it's not necessarily just about bikers, even though at the beginning of the commercial it said, you know, 173 bad boys or whatever. Like, so they're already kind of priming us to sort of read a story into that scenario. But let's go on to the next example. So when you hear the word bias or implicit bias or unconscious bias, what are your associations with that? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? You know, what are just some things that immediately pop to mind when you hear that? One person. Can I just get one response to this?
Excuse me. There was a lot of feedback over what you were saying, and I didn't catch your question at all.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully you can hear me a little bit better. I'm trying to manage the sound source from the presentation, but I was asking, when you hear the term bias, what's your association with it? Is it positive? Is it negative? Is bias good? Is it bad? What do you all think?
I think that is basically like their precipitation, their view of certain things. But generally speaking, I think as a whole or collectively, people typically think bias could be a negative or not such a good thing. Just like an insecurity.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So a lot of people think of bias and they think of something negative, like you're biased against something or whatever. But obviously, there's a little bit more to unpack with that. And I like what you said about perception, because I think that's a really good way to think about it. But we'll go into that in just a second. So for our purposes, when we're talking about unconscious bias or implicit bias, what we're saying is that bias is something, it's a tendency or an inclination that a person has that results in a judgment without question. So without considering it, without thinking about it, it's an automatic response that people have because we don't necessarily want to think about absolutely everything in the world. So let's think about it this way. If you're walking home to your car after work or after your AmeriCorps service, and you're ready to open up your car and you see somebody walking towards you and it looks like they have a knife in their hand, are you going to stop and say like, what are you doing with a knife here at like 8:30 on a Tuesday night? That's kind of weird. Or are you going to make a judgment about that and then try to get out of there as soon as possible? You know, bias is not necessarily it's not morally good or morally bad, but it's something that we do automatically. And some of you may have heard the term fight or flight response, you know, like when you're in a situation where you feel scared or you feel like you don't have a lot of options, you know, all humans at a really deep instinctive level have been evolved to either react violently, you know, to kind of fight to protect yourself, or to try to run away to avoid a situation. And that's a perfect example of a bias. And so, you know, when we talk about a bias being kind of like an immediate instinct that we all have, it can be something that we do against something. It can be something that we're scared of doing, but you can also have positive biases. You can be biased in favor of something. So unconscious bias then is something that we do without awareness, without intention, and without control. It's sort of an automatic assumption that we make. And sometimes it comes into conflict with our conscious behavior, with our conscious attitudes. And so when we say something, when you have an unconscious bias for or against something, what we're saying is that you automatically have a feeling about it. And it's something that you just kind of feel without thinking about it, but it might be good or it might be bad. So to use what LaDonna said about a perspective, you know, a good way to think about this is that, you know, we have senses, we have eyes, we have, you know, hearing, we have brains that we use to you know, process information around the world that we receive, and all that information gets come in and it gets sorted out based on our experiences. And a bias might be a good analogy for this. Is a bias might be equivalent to a visual blind spot. It's something that we're not necessarily aware of that it's there, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't interact with the way, it doesn't change the way that we interact with the world around us. So a bias is something that changes how we think about other people. It is a belief or an attitude. It's not necessarily something concrete, but it's something that we feel and experience, and then we act upon it. It's very fundamental to the way that we encounter the world. So when we're talking about that example of like walking home, you know, to your car, and then you see something, a lot of times people just react to situations, and no one would say that's bad that you're reacting immediately. People might even you know, thank you, and they'd say like, wow, you've got really fast reaction, you know, really good instincts or something like that. So the question is, if we're in all these different situations, like the movie theater, but also like situations that we might encounter at our service sites or at work or in big conferences or with different types of groups of people, we encounter all these different types of blind spots, these different areas of our lives that are shaped and affected by our lived experiences. And so bias is not the same thing as prejudice. It's not the same thing as discrimination, because some of those things are conscious and some of those are the results of bias. So hopefully we can make that distinction that bias is about the individual, and discrimination or prejudice is about how that person or how those institutions act towards other people. So we're going to go into it a little bit more deeply to talk about like, well, what causes bias and what are the things that are happening in our brains that lead to more bias? And I'm going to give you another video. This one is based on research from a book by an Israeli psychologist named Daniel Kahneman. And it's a YouTube video, so it'll take just a second to load, but hopefully you all can hear the sound and everything.
You may not realize it, but your brain actually processes information in two very distinct ways. Like when you look at this photo, you instantly know she has blonde hair, is visibly angry, and likely has some choice words to yell. Without any effort, you experienced fast thinking. But if you look at the following problem, something different happens. Sure, you immediately know it's a multiplication problem, and you knew you could solve it if you had the energy, but didn't. If you do try, your muscles will tense, your pupils will dilate, and your heart rate will increase. Now, you've experienced slow thinking. These two systems of fast and slow thinking dictate much of our perception and reaction in life. Take these lines for example. It's clear that they're different lengths, but if you measure them, they're actually the exact same length. Even now that you know, System 1 or your fast thinking can't stop seeing the illusion because it acts automatically. A similar effect is seen here. Which figure is the largest? Again, they're all the same size, but the suggestion of perspective and depth causes your System 1 to interpret the picture as three-dimensional, even though it's on a flat two-dimensional surface. It's making quick work of the available information, and so your conscious System 2, or slow thinking, must compensate after the fact and choose not to believe your intuition or instinct. Want to see your System 2 in action? I'll show you a string of 4 digits, you read them aloud, then add 1 to each of the original digits. If the card reads 3795, the correct response would be 4806. We'll then go to the next card and you'll do the same, followed by the next card. Ready? Go. Few people can cope with more than 4 digits, but even harder is add 3. The interesting bit is that though your pupils would have dilated, you often become effectively blind when you fully engage System 2. Did you notice the color of the text change? Or how about the fact that the numbers completely changed when I put them off to the side? Listen to the following puzzle. A bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Chances are your System 1 intuition was yelling 10 cents. But this appealing System 1 answer we know is wrong. In fact, the correct answer is 5 cents. Even if you worked out the correct answer, you likely thought of 10 cents along the way. System 1 is trying to work out an answer as quickly and seamlessly as possible, which is extremely beneficial in everyday life. If every activity required full mental effort, it would be exhausting. But knowing this allows us to understand that not all of our first impressions are correct. How many animals of each kind did Moses take into the ark? So few people detect what is wrong with this question that it's been dubbed the Moses illusion. In fact, Moses took no animals, Noah did. Again, our brain invests as little resources as necessary so that things run quickly and smoothly. Because Moses is not abnormal in the biblical context, System 1 unconsciously detects an association between Moses and ark and quickly accepts the question. In a similar way, System 1 generates context without you knowing. Reading each of the following may seem fairly simple. A, B, C, Anne approached the bank, and 12, 13, 14. But your brain actually interpreted these ambiguous statements without you ever knowing. You could have read it as A, 13C or 12, B, 14, but your brain created the context unconsciously. Also, you likely imagined a woman with money on her mind walking towards a building with tellers. But if the sentence before this was, they were floating gently down the river, the entire scene would have changed because bank is no longer associated with money. Without an explicit context, System 1 quickly generates one based on previous experience. In this case, you've likely visited more banks than rivers, and so the context is resolved accordingly. This ties into a concept called priming. For example, if I said wash, how would you complete this word fragment? Most would see soap, but had I just shown you the word eat, you'd be more likely to see soup. In this way, both eat and wash prime your thoughts. Though System 2 likes to think that it's in charge and knows what's going on, the truth is that priming effects have even been shown to affect and modify behavior. These arise in System 1, and you have no conscious access to them. If you'd like to learn more about the thinking systems in your brain, check out the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, which covers it in great detail. I'll put a link in the description which you can check out. Got a burning question you want answered? Ask it in the comments or on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe for more weekly science videos.
All right, so there's a lot of information in there, and some of you may have followed along with every example they gave, and some of you may have been kind of overwhelmed because, as I said, they go through all these different types of examples, and each one of them is meant to illustrate a cognitive bias. So when we say cognitive bias, what we're saying is like a shortcut in terms of how your brain uses the resources at its disposal to process information and make a decision. But the big takeaways from this are, it can be helpful to think about our brain as having two different types of decision-making abilities. There's System 1 thinking and System 2 thinking. So fast thinking, which is the more reactive thing. When somebody says, what's 2 plus 2? You've done that a million times. It's on the tip of your tongue. You can just immediately spout out an answer, and you don't have to count. You don't have to say to yourself, okay, well, 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, that sort of thing. And then there's System 2 thinking, which is the slower, more deliberative thinking. But the interesting thing about this is that System 2 thinking is still pretty sloppy in terms of yielding correct answers because humans are evolved to try to preserve sugar and glucose, which are the two things that our brain needs to process and make information into actionable results. And from an evolutionary standpoint, human beings all have kind of a mental wall that they hit when they've been using their brains too much. So think back to if in college or high school or something like that, if you ever had to stay up really late and you were studying for an exam the next day, you may have had plenty of food, you may have had plenty of caffeine, but if you've been trying to cram information and you're like, putting lots and lots of facts and figures into your brain, there's probably going to be a point where you're like, oh my gosh, I'm not even that tired, or I'm not that hungry, but I just can't think anymore. Your brain feels tired. And that's because it's an organ that has limits. It has limitations in terms of how much fat and sugar, how much glucose and carbohydrates that it can use in order to process information. So the thing about this is something that's really important, is that there's all these different cognitive biases that are out there. There's the priming effect. There's the nearness effect. So for example, if you get mugged, when you're at the mall or somebody steals your wallet, you're going to think that theft is much more common than it actually is in real life because it happened to you and it really disrupts your day-to-day life. But that doesn't mean that theft affects everybody or that it's a big deal to everybody. But we have a tendency to think about ourselves as sort of the main character in our own story. And so when something happens to us, we think that that same thing is probably happening to everybody, when of course we could just be randomly affected by it. Likewise, here's a really good example that's based on the information from this book, but this is something that happened to me in real life. So I work in Frankfurt and I live in Lexington, and I generally drive home the same way. And I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like this, but sometimes when you've had a really long day of service or a really long day at work or a really long school day, sometimes you drive home and you get there and you don't remember the drive at all. It's just something that you were on autopilot basically the whole time. And it's not because you weren't conscious or you were blacked out or something like that. It's just nothing important happened. And so you made the trip the way you do 5 days a week or something like that. And you got home and don't remember anything about it. And again, that's a cognitive bias that our brains have, because if we were soaking up every single bit of information all the time and then storing it and holding on to it, that'd be a lot for our brains to process. And so likewise, for me, when I take a trip, generally what I do is I drive home, I park in my driveway, I unlock the key to my back gate, and then I use a second key and I unlock my house. And one of the interesting things happened is that I was having some people do some work on my house. And so I left the back gate unlocked. And I knew that they were going to be, I think, working on the foundation of my house. And so I came home one day, I parked in the driveway, the gate was unlocked, I said hi to the worker, and then I went up to my house and I couldn't get inside my house. And I was like, what is going on? And if you've heard this story before, or if you're pretty good with brain teasers, the issue was that I was using the key for the gate on my house because I was just on autopilot, because I was so used to opening up the gate first and then using the second key to open up my house. And I'm sure you all probably have had different situations like that when you're not thinking about it, when you're just kind of going through the motions, and then you get to a situation where, situation A doesn't really match up with action A. What you're doing as you move through the world isn't matching up with the situation around you. And sometimes you have to stop and take a step back and think about what's going on. So anyway, all that is to say is that this is pretty normal stuff. These are things that every single person deals with every single day of their life. And again, it's a bias, but it's neither good nor bad. It's just something that sometimes changes the way that we interact with the world around us. So sometimes you hear the expression seeing is believing. And a lot of you have probably, that like the world around us, the universe around us has, all sorts of different types of radiation and sound waves and visual light and all these different things that we can perceive that affect the world around us. But, the human eye can only perceive a very small amount of things. So if you look at this graph, you can see that, we can measure sounds and electromagnetic radiation, to millions of degrees, but humans only experience a very, very small perception of what's measurable in the world around us because we're just basically animals that can only perceive things that our eyes and ears can hear and tell us. Likewise, in that example, if you're really focused on something, your brain has limitations, because when you're trying to do math problems, or when you're really focused on writing a paper, or you're really focused on solving a problem, your brain has a tendency to kind of block out all the external stimuli to make it easier for you to focus on things. And as we saw in that video, that makes you effectively blind to other things that can happen around you, even if you think that you're being really attentive. So all that is to say is that seeing is believing is actually a pretty inaccurate way of thinking about how people move through the world. So at any piece of time, there's 11 million bits of information that could be measured. if we had a microscope, if we had a recorder, if we had an electromagnetic telescope, but only 40 to 50 pieces of information are actually absorbed into the human brain and then become implanted as memories. So along the way, all that information gets filtered through our senses. It gets filtered through our perceptions and our interpretations of events. It gets filtered through our preferences. So that's whether or not we are biased towards or against something. And then it also gets filtered through whether or not we're even paying attention to it in the first place. So if you think about it, people think of themselves as having really good memories, or they're really perceptive. They say like, oh, I never forget a face, or I can remember all these phone numbers from back in the day. But in reality, all that means is that there's something narrow that you're probably focused on, or something that your brain kind of is biased towards or against. And the rest of the time, you're using that to exclude other information. And that can make it really tricky when you're interacting with people. So here's another example. This is a commercial from a British traffic safety program, and it's in the form of a whodunit mystery. So basically, I want you to watch this video the first time and see if you see anything that changes. And then the second time, we'll go over it. You can see what's happening once you kind of step back.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
Sorry, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
Action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
So I promise this whole presentation just isn't gotcha videos and things like that. But I think that these are really good at sort of illustrating that when we're looking for something, or when we step into a situation where we think we know what the story is or what the narrative is, our brains are sort of evolved to try to make sense of it. We're trying to tell stories all the time so we can filter out random information from relevant information. And in certain situations, that means you completely miss the details because you think you're following the story. And I think that, like I said, this is something that happens to all people every single day. And some of you may have examples of that in your personal life. Some of you may have, experienced things that you've seen with other people. But it's not just about, whodunit mysteries or about solving things that you're, TV shows that you're watching or things like that. It can also extend to real social interactions with different human beings. So we've talked a little bit about how the brain can influence how we perceive things in the world. We talked about the limitations of our perceptions. We've talked about how, if you're blind, you might hear things better. You might have heightened other senses. If you have a limited sense of smell, then maybe that affects your memory of, a spring day when the flowers are fragrant. If you are really focused on a particular situation because you have a crush on somebody, you may be forgetting what the other people are doing on the periphery because this person is kind of the center of your attention. So there's all these different ways in which we're constantly kind of moving and selectively editing the information that we perceive, and then trying to turn that into a memory or a story or something where we can make sense of it. But then on top of that, there's also internal influences that we can discuss. So, the brain is sort of, evolved to filter out light from dark, contrasts. And so this is a psychological test portrait called a Rubin vase. So a lot of you have probably seen this before. If you look at the black space, it looks like two faces looking at each other. If you look at the white space, it looks like a vase. And so depending on where your attention is drawn immediately, you see two different images. Likewise, human beings are sort of evolved to look for faces, pattern recognition, try to make sense of the world around them. So this is a little mound on the surface of Mars that was photographed by the Voyager 1 space probe in the early 70s. And from this particular vantage point, at this particular point in the Martian sunrise, it looks kind of like a human face. But of course, at any other time of day, from any other perspective, it just looks like a little mound. And then this is a clip from a movie about a guy who kind of goes insane trying to find patterns within the stock market, and he's trying to make sense of it using a mathematical formula. And so in addition to having, different things going on within our brain, like we were talking about with system 1 thinking and system 2 thinking, there's also different ways that manifests itself in terms of, patterns of speech, patterns of perceptions, patterns of thought. So these two parts of the brain, the amygdala and the anterior cingulate cortex, are responsible for the fast brain thinking, the immediate reactive thinking. And then this prefrontal neocortex, which is in the very front mid-center part of your brain, is responsible for system 2, or slow thinking. So even though the brain has plasticity and can sort of reorient its functions for different purposes, especially if you've had a stroke or you've had a brain fever or hemorrhagic swelling, there's all sorts of different reasons why different parts of your brain can pick up different jobs to make sure that the whole body is functioning as best as it can. But under ideal circumstances, we actually have discrete parts of the brain that are responsible for different types of thinking. And so, when I was younger, I used to think intelligence was just, can you read information in a book and recite it? Can you remember it? But of course, there's emotional intelligence. There's people who are aware of what other people are feeling. There's athletic intelligence. There's people who can move their bodies and be sort of comfortable in their own physicality and using kinesthetics in a way where they can be creative physically. There's people who are musically intelligent. There's people who are artistically intelligent. There's all sorts of different types of intelligence. And all of those are basically different patterns of electrical stimulation within the brain manifesting through different lived experiences. And so I don't want to go too far off track, but I want you all to remember that in any situation, when you're encountering people, when you're encountering challenges in your own life, when you're encountering good things, bad things, or whatever, that's always getting filtered through your perceptions, through your lived experiences. And so when LaDonna said earlier that, bias is kind of a perception, that's a really useful way for thinking about it, because, we can perceive things through our eyes, but our perception, our bias can be kind of like a set of glasses or a set of lenses through which we see the world around us. And so what we want you all to think about is, when you go into a situation, are you seeing something? Are you seeing the interaction clearly? Are you focused on one particular thing because that's what your attention is drawn to? Are you drawing conclusions because it reminds you of a different experience? Are you acting for or against something because you're reminded of something else that may not be relevant in this particular situation? So in addition to internal influences in our brains and in the way that we perceive things that affect how we perceive the world around us, there's also external influences. So this pyramid is a representative of ancient Egyptian societal hierarchy. So social pressure influences how we think about things. If you trust somebody and they say, hey, this is what's going on in this particular situation, you may not think about it a second time. You may just trust that person's judgment and say, okay, that's good enough for me. Likewise, here's an example of lemmings. We've all heard the story of people who kind of blindly follow other people, even into situations where it may be hurtful or detrimental for them. My parents told me numerous times, I said, hey, I want to do this because my friend's doing it. And then, the inevitable response is, well, if your friend jumped off of a bridge, would you do that too? Or something like that. So that's kind of a cliche, but that is sort of indicative of the way that people interact with other people. Sometimes you're just kind of going along with the crowd. You want to fit in. You want to be a person who, is part of an in-group. And sometimes that means you're not actually paying attention to the details, or you're not necessarily thinking, hey, is this in alignment with how I want to be, or how I want to act, or who I want to spend my time with, that sort of thing. And then lastly, there's even examples. There's a linguistic hypothesis called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which was put together by an English and an American linguist. And the idea is that the words and vocabulary that we're taught actually shape our perception of the world around us. So, I think most of you have heard that Inuit Indians have multiple words for snow. And that's because there's a lot of snow in northern North America. And so this is something that people experience a lot of times, and they may have different types of words for snow because there's different types of snow out there. And if that's one of the predominant features of your landscape, you're probably going to pay attention to it a little bit more closely. Whereas if you grow up in, Georgia or Florida or something like that, it may be years in between snows. You may not see snow that frequently. And so you don't differentiate between, frost on your lawn versus maybe some small flakes versus a big flurry. It's all just different forms of snow to you. And that's not because, there's one objective word for snow or whatever. It's kind of like there's different types of clouds. I mean, they're all made of water vapor and particulate, but for a cloud scientist, a cirrus is really different from a cumulonimbus. So all that is to say, based on your context, based on your experience, whether or not you've studied something, whether or not you had a good experience with it or a bad experience, you may have completely different perceptions of something that's going on around you. So this is another funny commercial, but this is a good example of one of these external influences that changes how you perceive a social interaction.
You've got most people ideas. We could open an account on FedEx.com, save 10% on online express shipping.
Okay, how about this? We open an account on FedEx.com, we save 10% on online express shipping.
You just said the same thing I said, only you did.
Yes, now I did this.
That's good. Right on the nose.
All right. So that's a Super Bowl commercial from like 10 years ago. So in the spirit of recent Super Bowls, we're going to talk a little bit about this because I'd be curious to see what you think. Can anybody break down this commercial and tell me what's happening in it?
I mean, someone's suggesting something and then nobody listens to him, but because that's really because of his place in the pecking order of the office. And then somebody else repeats it, but who has more standing and more power in the office, and so people listen to him.
All right. Thank you, Caitlin. So people are sitting around a table and one person says, we've got to figure out the solution. We've got to, cut costs. What are some ideas? And one person suggests a solution, and then nobody reacts. And then the other person suggests the same thing, and people are like really excited about it. And we read this situation. So even though we just turned on this commercial, we don't have any context. We sort of implicitly know what's going on in here. It means we know without really thinking about it or interrogating it too closely what the dynamic is. So who's the boss in this scenario? Anybody?
I tried to turn on my microphone and turned on my camera instead. The older white man in the nicer looking suit sitting at the head of the table, as opposed to the younger white man with longer, shaggier hair in a much less socially acceptable, i.e. feeding into white supremacist narratives of what is and is not work attire. His clothes are messier and seem cheaper.
Yeah.
So these are all like, I was a theater major. These are all clues that the director and costume designer of this commercial would have placed in the frames to also tell us things implicitly about what the pecking order is, as Caitlin said.
Yeah, that's perfect. So so the way that people are dressed influences our perception of who is the boss and who is the subordinate. Likewise, where are they sitting at the table? Is the boss sitting in the middle of the table in between a bunch of people, or are they at the end of the table? Is the boss the younger person or the older person? Is the boss the person who's dressed, in kind of frumpy clothes, or is the boss the person wearing the suit with the power haircut? They even make a joke about it. They call it lampshading if you're talking about writing. Lampshading is where something is so obvious that you draw attention to it, so that way it's not distracting from the plot. The guy says, well, you just did the exact same thing I did. Like, if that happened in real life and somebody just immediately repeated you, why would you ever pay attention to the second person who says that? And they call it lampshading because it's like, oh, well, the lampshade's right here. We're just going to call attention to it and move on. And the boss character in this says, oh, no, you see, the difference is I made this gesture with my hand, and that's like the power gesture. So it's a joke, but it's not a joke. And over time, as I've shared this commercial with a bunch of people, generally speaking, the folks who have experienced a situation like this tend to be women. They tend to be females or, identify as women. And so, maybe this is actually, even though it's a joke, maybe this is actually kind of representative of a social dynamic that some or all of you have experienced before. Maybe you've been like me and you've been the person who actually cut off somebody for speaking because they were speaking in a timid way, or they're speaking quieter, or they, present themselves a little bit more uncertain. And so you just kind of bulldoze over them. And in our society, a lot of those folks tend to be women, which, leads to the situation where men talk over women a lot. They interrupt people. They tend to, kind of accentuate their own ideas and disregard other people's ideas, not based on the strength of the idea itself, but based on the social dynamics. Does anybody want to share anything about this or have any other sort of comments about what's going on in the commercial?
I had a follow-up thought, but I've already spoken, and I can't see if anyone else has raised their hand.
I don't see anybody else raising their hand, so go for
it. I remember that you said that this commercial was about 10 years old, and so what you were saying about this being an experience that often women in the workplace have made me notice even more the fact that all of the people in that shot seem to be men, and all of the people in that shot seem to be white. And and that made me wonder if this commercial were being filmed now as opposed to 10 years ago, would the makeup of the cast of the commercial be different or not, depending on who was in the room creating the commercial and what point they were trying to make.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. You know, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation. You know, society is changing. You know, there's a lot of time. I was watching a TV show from like 15 years ago, 17 years ago, that I really like. And even the boundaries of humor in that time period have changed a lot. Things that I thought were funny 15 years ago are not quite as funny now, you know, or maybe it's humor that's at the expense of, you know, other people or marginalized people. And I can remember, you know, being younger and thinking it was funny and sort of like rationalizing it to myself. And now I'm a little bit older and I've had a little bit more interactions with different types of people, and I can say, oh, this joke is actually at the expense of somebody who's like, you know, they didn't do anything wrong. They're just, you know, being made fun of in the context of this situation. And like Grace said, you know, is it really appropriate in 2022 to make a, a commercial about a workplace situation where it's entirely white men, as though those are the only people making decisions in a business or something? It's not necessarily representative of reality, but is that appropriate? Is that something where we want to do it that way? And I'm not saying that it is or is not. I'm not saying there's a.
I should say that my point really was more that that having those people be the people that are in the room shows the bias and expectation of those who are making the commercial, but that can still often very much be the case. And I was more trying to point out the fact that the guy who's getting talked over is still a white guy. And even 10 years ago, in the context of an actual workplace environment, is that young man who was more likely to be talked over in this scenario? And is that because that would be what that room would be made up to look like? Or is that because the people making the commercial didn't think about the fact that women or people of color, or both, could be in that situation to begin with?
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation, and I apologize if I was putting words in your mouth or kind of mischaracterizing what you were saying earlier. I think those are all really valid observations, and likewise, you know, we're meant to just look at this 30-second clip and kind of pull all the different pieces that are presented into it and make a story out of it, and then get the jokes and kind of follow along with the beats of the story, and then we wrap it up and we understand that it's actually a sales pitch for FedEx. You know, there's a lot of things that we're supposed to receive and perceive, and then draw our own conclusions. And you know, the idea is that if you do good advertising, everybody draws the same conclusion from it, and you know that's, you know, helps your client or whatever, and then you move on. But of course, a person could they could do a close reading of this commercial from a lot of different perspectives and draw totally different conclusions. This could very easily be a situation where the company's doing terrible. That's because they've got this old group of people who've done things the same way for years and years and years. And then they bring in a younger person who maybe was like a whiz kid at an Ivy League school or something like that. Maybe they went to Harvard or Yale or something like that, and they did really, really well. And now they're coming in with fresh ideas, but the old company doesn't accept those new ideas because it's a bunch of people who've known each other for a while, and it's kind of like a boys club or something like that. So there's a lot of different ways that you can read the limited information that's in this commercial. And likewise, let's say this commercial is dubbed over into a different language. Let's say it's dubbed over into Swahili, or it's dubbed over into Japanese, or it's dubbed over into like a Michoacan dialect or something. People from different cultures might look at the same exchanges between the same actors, but read it differently than we do, because they come from a different cultural context. So it's really important to recognize that this is an American commercial with American actors made for American audiences. And so we bring all of that context with us when we read the limited information in this commercial and then arrive at, you know, the conclusion. And that's not necessarily universal, and it's not the same for everybody else. So I'm kind of like beating that point to death, but the analogy is that anytime any of you walk into a room You're bringing your own lived experiences into that room. You're looking around with your biases, your perceptions. You're trying to read a situation. And if you like a person or dislike a person, if you're having a good day or a bad day, if you've eaten or haven't eaten, all of those things sort of affect the way that you read situations and the way that you understand the world around you. And so there's a lot of different pieces that all factor into this kind of analysis that we do as we're filtering information. You know, what's the gender of the person that you're interacting with? What's the body type? Are they you know, slim or heavy set? What's their facial expressions? You know, what is their age? What's their ethnicity? What's their skin tone? Do they look like you? Do they look different from you? What's their posture? Do they seem like they're really engaged and attentive, or are they kind of like slouching back and they seem disinterested? What type of clothing are they wearing? What's the setting? Are you in a work environment? Are you in a service environment? Are you in a casual environment? Like, are you at a bar or like a social club or something like that? So all of these different things impact the way that we read situations and other people. And so I want you to think about all this as we're talking about unconscious bias or implicit bias at your service site or at your work or at college or, you know, wherever that may be, because basically all the different mechanisms that we have in our brain and all the different things that we're sort of socialized to read and understand, like what we were saying, like interactions with older people or interactions with people in a hierarchy or interactions with people who look different from us or who have an accent or something like that. All of that affects the way that we perceive and the way that we filter information. And like I said earlier, you can be biased towards something or you can be biased against something. So if somebody reminds you of a person who you like, you're probably going to have a really different experience meeting a stranger than if they remind you of somebody who you dislike. So these are real examples that we got from the university where I used to work. And these are just little sound clips we got from people when they went into a classroom setting on the first day. So the first person said, "He thinks I don't know what I'm talking about, and I haven't opened my mouth yet." Next person said, "I really like him. He reminds me of my brother." The last person said, "She's older than my mom. There's no way she'll listen to my ideas." So these are real life experiences that people had in a classroom environment. But obviously we can draw parallels to things that we experience at service sites. And so some questions to ask yourself consciously as you're interacting with different types of people, or you're in a situation where, you know, you don't necessarily know what's going on or you don't know the person well, is, you know, what assumptions am I making about this other person? What assumptions am I making about this type of situation? What are some patterns that I notice that might be affecting my feelings? You know, some people, honestly, if they haven't had lunch, they get really angry and it just makes everything about their day negative. That doesn't mean that the person is a bad human being. It just means that maybe their blood sugar is low or something like that. Some people, it doesn't matter if they eat for 2 days. Their mood is really consistent. None of that changes. You know, that's not as big of an issue with them. But it doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It's just different types of people, different ways of interacting with them. You could ask yourself, like, what about this person is bothering me? Do I know that I have any sort of biases impacting my attitude right now? And likewise, what can I do to change my behavior? Like, is there a way that I can act consciously to try to ameliorate or mitigate this situation? And so that brings us to kind of the next stage of the unconscious bias training, which is that there is no perfect solution to unconscious bias. Basically, you know, people bring all sorts of baggage with them, good baggage, bad baggage, whatever, to any situation that they interact with. And it's only by being, you know, rational and clear-headed and being honest with yourself about what your good qualities and your bad qualities are, where you can be honest when you're interacting with other people. If somebody gives you feedback and you're not willing to listen to it, you're probably going to have experiences where bias affects you because you're not willing to change your outlook. If you're in a situation where you have a positive association towards someone, but they disappoint you, you need to ask yourself, did this person earn my positive feelings toward them? Or is this something where I just kind of trusted them naturally because, you know, they remind me of somebody, or because I like them, or because they're in a position of authority? Likewise, if you have a negative association with a person, are you being fair? Did that person actually do anything to earn your negative judgment? Or is that just a feeling you had when you met them and it wasn't something that was necessarily based in truth or reality? So when you all are thinking about different types of interactions you have with people, there's a few different acronyms that we can go over. One of them is LEARN. We want you all to listen first and foremost. You need to be willing to hear other people. You need to be willing to take advice. 2, you need to be willing to engage with people or groups of people who you don't know very well, or people that you might even have a bias towards. 3, you need to be willing to adjust your surroundings. And if you're in a bad situation, or you're around people who are negative, or you're in a circumstance where you're not getting the kind of support you need, you should probably take steps to try to address that. Either talk to the person, talk to your site supervisor, talk to Holly or Caitlin, talk to your program directors, and try to get some help so that way you're having a better experience day to day at your site. If you have an interaction with somebody that seems kind of prickly or it feels uncomfortable, whatever, try to react with friendliness and honesty. Try to be engaged in a way where you're willing to listen to them and you're willing to kind of work through any sort of minor misunderstanding so you can get past that prickliness and hopefully have a better working relationship with them. And then finally, you have to be willing to kind of shine a flashlight on yourself. You have to be willing to notice your own behaviors and notice the way that your thoughts impact your behaviors. So an example that we give in this training is that your intention is different than your impact. So if I step on somebody's foot accidentally, it's not because I did it on purpose, but that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt the other person. Just because you didn't intend to hurt somebody's feelings doesn't mean that it doesn't have a real life consequence. So I strongly encourage you all to take some time, every couple of days, maybe even just 5 minutes a day, to sort of think about how you're interacting with other people, saying, am I doing what I want to be doing? Am I being friendly or generous or helpful in the way that I want to be? Am I giving somebody too hard of a time, or am I being disappointed by somebody who maybe hasn't earned my goodwill, And it's not about passing judgment on people. It's just about being a little bit more clear-eyed and rational about the way that you choose to interact with people. Because at the end of the day, if you start to think about your own decisions, it moves from being an unconscious choice where you're just reacting to the world around you and you're not thinking about it, to something that you are thinking about, and therefore you do have a decision in the matter. And I think that that's really powerful and really important, because ultimately we want to be engaged people. We want to try to have a positive impact. We're doing AmeriCorps because we're trying to live out our values. But if we're just doing that on autopilot, we're not thinking about it, we're just reacting, we're probably not going to have the most impact, and we're not going to get the most out of our service experiences. So like I said, I strongly encourage you all to take 15 minutes, half an hour. Maybe you meditate, maybe you wake up in the morning and just kind of think about your why, find your purpose, consider some of these things, so that way you're not just reacting to the world around you, you're actually acting with intention, because ultimately that's going to be the best way for you to address and mitigate bias in your life. And this is something that we talked a little bit about it just a moment ago. We talked about how there's all these different aspects of humanity, different things that we perceive in other people that affect how we judge them, how we're biased towards or against them. And some of you have mentioned this already. We've kind of talked about it when we were discussing the movie theater example at the very beginning of the presentation. But there's all these different dimensions to diversity. So that can include, physical ability. Is this person handicapped or in a wheelchair, or, using crutches, or are they disabled in some way? It could be language based. It could be like, do they have a foreign accent or a dialect? socioeconomic status. How do they present? Do they look wealthy? Do they look poor? Are they wearing nice clothes? Are they wearing, frumpy clothes? Are they wearing out of date clothes? Sexual orientation, gender. There's all these different aspects of diversity that most people weren't aware of, 10 or 15 years ago. But now, as a culture, we're starting to have some of these conversations, and we're starting to see more representation in TV and movies and music. But we're also having people who are kind of reacting against that, and people who are scared, or they feel disrupted by this whole situation. They feel like they're not, the culture or world that they live in is not familiar as it used to be. So again, this isn't a good or bad thing, but this is something that's happening, and it's something that you all might encounter when you're at your service sites. So we want you to be aware of that. I see a raised hand. Is this Brianna?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I was just wanting to point out that I think it's also important for us to consider how people don't just show up as one of those things at a time. Either like people are intersectionally connected to all of those things. So it's already hard enough to think about one of those things, but we have to even try harder because people will try. I mean, not people will try. People show up as multiple parts of their identity too, not just that one part that might stand out the most to us.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I think that's a really good point. And for those of you who haven't heard the term intersectional, a good way to think about it is that, every person wears multiple hats. You might be a soccer player, and you're a Christian, and you're a vegetarian, and you're a mom, and you identify as, like Irish Catholic American or something like that. And the idea is that, different people wear different hats in different situations. But if you're a person who, has an identity that's kind of disadvantaged by society, or if you have multiple disadvantaged identities, then that can make it more challenging when you're trying to interact with people. And we'll kind of get into that in just a second, because as we'll see in our society, we tend to privilege certain types of people, or certain choices, or certain backgrounds over different people. So for example, there is a beauty bias. Attractive people make much more money over the course of their lifetimes than less conventionally attractive people. According to this survey that was done in the early parts of the 20-teens and published in 2015, that's $250,000 in pay differentials over the course of a lifetime. So people who are conventionally attractive, or people who kind of fit this like cultural standard of beauty, tend to be deemed more trustworthy, more intelligent, and better at their jobs, even though their performance evaluations may not reflect that. Likewise, and this kind of gets to what Brianna said, certain people are disproportionately penalized for their attractiveness, and it tends to be women. So it's not that it just impacts men or women, or trans individuals, or whatever, or non-binary people. It impacts certain people much more than others. And generally speaking, ugly men are not penalized in the same way that ugly women might be, And I don't say that like ugly, like there's an objective standard of ugly. I'm just using that in kind of a generalized context. Likewise, there is a gender bias in work situations. Males tend to be rewarded more with higher salaries. I think almost all of you have probably heard that women make somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 75% as much money as men do for the exact same positions. Caitlin, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, for like the study that you were talking about beauty, I kind of wonder how the study measures what is considered beautiful, only because that feels so culturally contextual. So like, to give you an example, I've been watching a lot of America's Next Top Model, and in the earlier seasons, they're very much about one type of look, and that look is extremely, extremely, extremely thin, like rail thin. with very distinct facial features, and quite honestly, Eurocentric facial features that I think still today, what's considered attractive still revolves around like quote unquote white beauty standards. So I kind of even question, it makes me personally question even the study, because it's like there's other things at play when they're talking about beauty. And that can also also we're speaking about, I guess, biases here in the States, whereas like in another country, what's considered beautiful might be different as well. And I can't give you an example off the top of my head because I don't know, but like, I just kind of wonder about how like that beauty is measured, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid question. I don't have the study in front of me, although I did do some research based on it a few years ago. And my understanding is that basically they would get an impartial panel of people, whatever that looks like, to rank applicants' photos based on attractiveness on a scale of like 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. So, if you know that you're going to have 20 people submit applications for a job, then and the resume is the same in each one, then they would find out that the people who have, more conventionally attractive faces tended to be the ones who, received better offers or, were given better salaries and things like that. But I thought you made a really good point too, that, beauty standards are very culturally specific. I think everybody's heard about, the women of Myanmar who wear brass rings around their necks and kind of lower their shoulder blades. And that, in that particular culture, that's a really celebrated form of beauty. And so there's not one specific type of beauty that is or is not acceptable in certain situations. But again, this is all perspective, because the people who are making decisions about beautiful applicants are not the people at the bottom of the corporate chain. They're the people at the top of the corporate chain. And as you all know, those tend to be a certain type of person, namely older, male, white people, So it's not to say that the beauty bias isn't real, but where is the bias coming from, I guess is a better way to put it. And is it coming from people who are all equals and they're all sort of like at an equivalent level of responsibility or authority? Or is it coming from people who disproportionately have more power and more influence? And so that kind of, hopefully gets back to the point that Brianna was making, that, some people are sort of rewarded more for their backgrounds or things about their identity. And some people are sort of punished more or disproportionately penalized for things about their identity, even though you may not have any choice in the matter. So with the gender bias, again, they did a research study. I thought this was pretty interesting. So the University of Illinois at Chicago has a really great lab, and it's run by a female professor, and they are, I think 40 or 50% of their lab fellows are female. They do a really good job of addressing gender disparities in STEM fields, science, technology, education, and math. And so everybody thought when this group was going to be part of this gender bias study that they would just knock it out of the park because they're very intentional about hiring women. But basically what they did is researchers created 127 job resumes that were identical, and all they did was change the first name of the applicant, from John to Jennifer. And at the end of the day, every single lab that they sent these applications to, they were all sent to scientific labs. Even the lab that was run by a female and had a disproportionately high number of female research fellows selected more male applicants than female applicants, even though the job resumes were the same. So again, this is to show you that even things that we think that we're aware of, even areas where we think that, I know what this bias is, or I know that there's a social bias, or I know that there's, like a larger pattern within society, we can still be susceptible to those things if we're not paying attention to it. And that's because of the number one bias that we all experience, which is confirmation bias. If you think that something is supposed to be a certain way, or you think that something should be a particular way, you are more likely to see that relationship there, even if it doesn't actually exist in reality. There's a height bias. The average height of a man in the United States is right around 5'9". The average height of a CEO in the United States is 6 feet tall. The average height of a Fortune 500 CEO is 6'3". So even though tall men are disproportionately a very small part of the population by percentage, they're disproportionately rewarded in certain types of professional settings because people see them as more commanding or more powerful or more domineering or whatever. And there's a fact that says for every inch of height, that equates to almost $800 in salary difference a year. And I'm sure with inflation, that figure has only gone up over time. Likewise, there's a weight bias. Heavier people tend to be discriminated against more than skinny people. Caitlin mentioned, really thin Eurocentric version of beauty or attractiveness. And again, women are penalized much more steeply than men are. For women, they start to be discriminated against or feel these kinds of social pressures in their work scenarios when their BMI or body mass index is around 27. Whereas men are not at serious risk of weight discrimination until their BMI is around 35. There's an ethnicity bias. Everybody knows this, but this is just another way to kind of verify that. Ethnic minorities this figure is about 8 or 10 years old, but in the early parts of the 20-teens, ethnic minorities only held about 7% of board seats in the United States. Ethnic minority women only held about 3.2% of board seats. But at this point, over 40% of the population is an ethnic minority, if you're categorizing in those terms. And so clearly there's something wrong when people are not being represented in different venues of power and authority. So the question I want to ask you all, and this is where we get into the more reflective part of the presentation as we start to wrap up, is, there's all these different aspects of identity and diversity and personal appearance, and everybody has biases for and against things. So the thing I want you all to think about is, what are your biases? Because we all have them. And I'll give you a good example. So I'm from Central Kentucky. I went to college. I had a job where I was going to Eastern Kentucky fairly regularly. And one day I went to a diner to get lunch, and I ordered like a hamburger and some French fries. And this woman in front of me was picking up her order. And she was probably like a few years older than me. So, she seemed like she probably had kids. She was dressed, a little bit more shabbily, like her clothes were clearly older, a little bit more worn out. I was wearing business attire, I was wearing like a suit jacket and stuff like that. And she went to pay for her meal, and her credit card was declined. And she said, she had a real thick Eastern Kentucky accent. She's like, "Oh no, that's no problem. I've got another card. Why don't you write in this card?" And her second card was declined. And then she said, "I don't know what's going on with this. I just paid the bill. Why don't you try this last card? This is my debit card." And her debit card was declined. And so I went in and just held my card out. And I said, "Oh, it's no problem. I'm picking up an order too. Why don't you just put these both on the same tab?" And I thought I was being a real smooth, nice guy. And this woman kind of turned to me and she's like, "I didn't ask you for help." And she got really kind of up in my face. And I was sort of taken aback. And so I said, "I'm sorry. I was just trying to help out." And I paid for my meal and left. And when I went back to my car, I was really steaming. And I was thinking like, God, what a jerk. I was trying to help this person out. They don't have any money in their account. And she is getting mad at me. And of course, it took a few days, and I was sort of thinking about that, and I was like, it was probably really insulting to somebody who I don't know to walk into a scenario and basically, without asking them or trying to have a conversation, presuming that I can just fix their problem. I mean, who's to say that she wasn't having an issue with her bank, or that the credit card machine at the diner was down, or whatever? It could have been any number of situations. And then she has this stranger come in and basically try to, like, you know, like take care of her situation for her. Yeah, I could see how that would be a really insulting type scenario. But, you know, I thought, based on how my parents raised me and my assumptions about people in Eastern Kentucky, and, you know, my kind of my notions of like heterosexism, about how men are supposed to treat women, I was sort of thinking like, oh, well, I'm going to do this person a favor, and I'll be, you know, sort of chivalrous, or I'll be really polite about that. And I didn't ask her at all. I didn't include her in that conversation. That was entirely me and my experience being expressed in her real world scenario. And I got to leave, and I'm not back in that community, but she has to live there every day probably. So that's just one example of a scenario where, you know, I came in with one set of expectations and I thought I was doing a good thing, and somebody else had a really different perception of the same events. So some of you, if you want to share that situation, you can. If not, that's totally cool. But the idea is, I want you to think about awkward encounters you've had with other people in the past. And I want you to think about, you know, when you're at your service site, if you interact with somebody and it's tense or unpleasant or something doesn't seem right, and you feel like you're doing everything properly, it doesn't ever hurt to go over that, you know, to debrief with somebody, maybe another AmeriCorps member, to talk to your site supervisor. If you need to, you might even need to talk to your, you know, your program manager, and just say like, hey, I'm going to walk you through this scenario. Did I do things right? Is there something I was missing in this case? Because again, we all bring our own unconscious, you know, implicit biases to different scenarios. And sometimes we don't see that unless we talk it through with somebody else, unless we kind of debrief and try to make sense of the scenario and try to understand, like, if our whole goal is to help people and to try to have like positive interactions with other people who are in really challenging situations, then maybe that requires more empathy than normal. Maybe that requires a type of like customer service skill, or like a, you know, a mentality, an advocacy mentality that you don't normally use day to day. It may not be something that you think of immediately when you're trying to solve a problem. Maybe you're just trying to fix a situation, but you don't have emotional intelligence. And that's something I've been guilty of plenty of times. You know, if somebody tells me a situation in their personal life, I say, oh, well, why don't you just do this? You know, and maybe the person was actually asking for some sympathy. Maybe they wanted me to kind of relate to them and understand the emotional challenges they're going through. And again, that's something that, you know, I try to work through and get better at, you know, week by week, year by year, because we're all trying to be better people at the end of the day. So all that is to say that everybody has different types of assumptions that they make. And the way that those play out in real life has all sorts of different interactions. And if you are a person who has a repeated bias and you are unwilling to address it or unable to make sense of it, then that can have real world consequences in the form of, you know, discrimination or repeated antagonisms or microaggressions, or all these different terms that we hear thrown around, but they mean something. These are real words that have actual real world implications. And we're not saying it to shame you all like you all are imperfect people. We're all imperfect people. Nobody here is perfect. Nobody operates with total clarity and intention 24 hours a day. Everybody makes mistakes. We're all just trying to get better at it and hopefully be aware of the way in which we can be presumptive or overbearing, or, you know, we don't stand up for ourselves, or we're unduly timid, or we don't advocate for other people when we're in a position of authority or privilege. You know, the idea is that we want you all to be aware of the ways in which you feel empowered, and then hopefully share that with other people. So I want you all to think about, you know, how do your biases impact your interactions with people on your team? How do they impact your day-to-day member experience? How do they interact with the types of relationships you have in your community? Because you can see how over time, small things like your personal background leads to a bias that you might have, which then leads to certain types of behaviors, such as microaggressions or inadvertent slights or insults to other people, which then leads to advantages or disadvantages as you give certain people the benefit of the doubt over other people. You give certain people an advantage over other people. And then ultimately, that can lead to systematic inequalities and inequalities in our society. But the good news is that we are not set in stone. Our brains are not fixed. People can change. People can evolve and adapt over time. And so the way that you do that is by reworking the plasticity of your brain. Sometimes people do that through therapy. Sometimes they do it through yoga or through religious meditation. Sometimes people, go through these like mindfulness retreats, or they put themselves in a sensory deprivation tank. There's all sorts of different ways that people can kind of change the way that their neurochemical pathways in their brain respond to stimuli. But the best way to do that, honestly, day to day, is, like I said, take some time to yourself, make some quiet space whenever possible, think about who you are, how you want to act, and think about the ways in which the person that you are is a little different from the person you want to be. And so that just takes time, and that's something that you can keep a journal doing. You can write yourself daily affirmations. You can get a group of people who support you, and you can all be working on it as a shared experience. You can talk to a therapist or a religious instructor or a trusted parent or mentor or something like that. It doesn't have to be a solo pursuit, but the idea is that we want you to take time to address it, because if you are aware that there's issues in your life, you're aware that there's inconsistencies or biases or inadequacies, but you don't take the time to address it, the problems are going to persist, and you're not going to be able to resolve things in a way that is impactful. And ultimately, I think that means you're going to be less effective as an AmeriCorps member, and even as a active, engaged member of society. People talk about partisanship, and they talk about heightened tensions between different groups of people, and the way that we can make our own small change toward that thing is by trying to talk with different people, by seeking to understand, by being generous in spirit, by understanding the way that we move through the world is not the way that other people move through the world. And so, I want you all to understand that there's limits to communication. I'll give you an example. Written communication is great if you want to really take time and get down into detail and explain, a situation as you perceive it. But written communication can be really limited if you're moving really quickly, if you don't provide a lot of context, and if you don't have a really strong, trusting relationship with the other person. Great example is text messages. Text messages can be really easily misunderstood, and emails can too if you don't provide context. So, for example, there's a phrase with 7 words that I'm going to say. I didn't say he stole the book. And if you read that, it seems pretty clear what that means. But if you are trying to convey emphasis, especially in a verbal way, it can read really different. If you say, I didn't say he stole the book, well, that just means, I didn't say it, but somebody else did. Or I didn't say he stole the book. That means I may not have said it out loud, but I'm implying in some other way. I didn't say he stole the book. You're saying, maybe somebody else stole the book. I didn't say he stole the book. Maybe you're implying that this person borrowed the book. Or if you say, well, I didn't say he stole the book, and so these are all just different things that can be lost in translation when we're moving from verbal to non-verbal communication. So we want you all to be aware of that. There's a million different ways in which you can communicate with site supervisors and other AmeriCorps members and program directors and all these different people on a day-to-day basis. And if you're not providing context for them, they may read it in a totally different way than how you meant it. And that can lead to frustration and arguments and misunderstandings. And so just strongly encourage you all to be aware of that. If possible, try to have face-to-face contact or phone conversations, but obviously we're all just making do as best we can. But instead, we want you to be aware of the way that you interact with other people. Be aware of the way that you move through the world, because it's otherwise it's automatic, and it's one of those things where we just kind of make assumptions, and our assumptions may not be in line with reality. So I asked you these questions earlier. When you are interacting with people, I think it's really important to be able to kind of shine a flashlight on yourself, to think about how you're interacting with them, think about what you're perceiving from them, and think about what you're giving off when you interact with other people. And so the 6 steps for recognizing bias are to, 1, recognize that everyone has bias, that it's normal. To be able to shine a flashlight on yourself and kind of think objectively about how you're moving through the world and how you're interacting with other people. Be comfortable not knowing something or not having a judgment on a situation. It's totally cool if you don't really know enough to make a decision, or you don't know enough to have an opinion on the matter. Sometimes things are just kind of uncertain, and that's okay. You can just wait until you have more information before you make a judgment. But you have to be willing to also be awkward and uncomfortable. And if you are just kind of moving from situation to situation without kind of feeling out your emotions or feeling out somebody else's emotions, that can be perceived as harmful or insensitive. And so you want to be able to interact with different people in a way where you're open to their feedback and their thoughts. Also, I strongly encourage you all to interact with different types of people in your day-to-day life. You may think that you only like certain types of people, or you're only interested in people who have the same background as you or the same interests as you. But I strongly encourage you to consider trying to find commonalities with different folks. And lastly, get feedback from people whenever possible. Solicit input, ask people, say, hey, this is what I was trying to say earlier. Did that come across? Is that something that made sense to you? Could I have handled this differently? And be open to that sort of thing. So that's the end of my presentation. I know I went through a lot in the last 20 minutes, but hopefully you all have some things to think about. I'm happy to stay on for a little while if you have any questions for me. And likewise, you're also welcome to email me or contact me at any point. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And
Andrew, this is Carla.
Hi, Carla.
I have sometimes I say I wouldn't say anything, but then 2 things I wanted to ask is, one, in the last part of your presentation, you said to shine the light on yourself. If you know that you have an issue or problem, seek help. But with the world evolving so much, with cultures and cultural backgrounds, some of it is going away, some of it is being held on too tightly. I'm not going to change this because this is who I am. You have to deal and interact with people with that mindset. So even with your situation where you were taught to be nice and kind, with that lady not realizing that, it's sort of like difficult when you're in a work setting, in a work culture that I mentioned is evolving so quickly, and you're trying to keep up with that. It's pretty much difficult because yesterday there will be a change for something you're not aware of, and here it is, you go with your happy jolly self trying to make everybody happy and comfortable, and you make a statement that evolved overnight and you weren't aware of it. And so you're placed in a predicament, and it's like it's forced on you to deal with it. So in the sense of you're getting help for yourself, because I'm going to speak from my perspective, coming from my culture. We're a culture that say things that we don't think is offensive to others. So now you're in a new culture, and just the same thing, like I said, it's like I'm not going to change to please anybody. It's a wrong mindset, but I'm trying to keep up with the many different cultures, because we're in America. It's not just Americans, it's everybody, here, multiple cultures here. And how do we keep up with all of that?
Carla, I think that's a really good question. And I know that you and I have kind of talked about this a little bit in the past, but this is the way that I understand it. And this is just my own, I'm taking off my trainer hat. I'm just kind of sharing my own personal opinion on this. In my life, I've had disagreements with really good friends of mine over things that I felt like didn't affect me directly. So the best example I can give is some people feel very comfortable in their skin. They know who they are. They know what they're about. They know what their values are. They know, and life for them can be about, how do you do the things you want to do? And for other people, I think life is much more about exploration and kind of making sense of yourself and being on a journey of self-discovery. And sometimes the way that you were raised is really different than how you want to be or how you want to end up. And it can be, and your sense of identity can change over time, and that can be, your sexuality, that can be your gender identity, that can be any number of different things. It can be your career, your religion, any number of things. And as someone who has felt pretty stable in my life, I don't always completely identify or understand people who are on a more personal journey. But like I said in the course of the presentation, I think it's really important to try to come with a sense of humility and try to, create an opportunity to talk with people if they want to talk about it, and try to, be understanding and sympathetic that other people are going through different life experiences than you are. And it's not necessarily your place to put judgment or tell people if you think they're right or wrong. But again, it's different from person to person, because the relationship that Holly and I have as colleagues is pretty different than the relationship that I have with some of the other AmeriCorps program staff. It can be different than the relationship I have with my mom. It's different than the relationship I have with, the pastor at my church or something like that. So every relationship is like it's a two-sided dynamic, it's two different perspectives, and you're trying to find some sort of commonality. So I know that this doesn't really answer your question, but I would strongly encourage you to just kind of state your values. Say, hey, I'm just trying to understand you. I'm trying to find a way where we can kind of connect. There's a term it's a Greek philosophical term called epoche, EPOCHE. And it basically means suspending your own judgment so you can understand the world from another perspective. And I think that epoche is a really great way to try to connect with other people. Again, if they want to talk to you, or if they want to share some of those experiences. Sometimes you don't want to have to explain yourself to another person. Sometimes you don't want to, it feels like an interrogation or something. And I think we all need to be respectful of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it can be really helpful if you just kind of state your intentions and just say, hey, I feel like I don't quite understand what's going on, or we're not on the same page. I'd like us to connect in some way.
I've tried those things, and sometimes I feel it's like if something is explained to you, or in general, like you have a conversation with some people and they explain from their perspective. To me, sometimes I feel as if it is, okay, I tell you this, so now you have to act differently. That's what I feel. So it's like, give me the opportunity to process things. And I feel sometimes in some situations, that's how the world responds. So like you said, I don't lock people off, but I'm like, okay, I'm not winning this battle, so let it go.
And sometimes you have to do that, Carla. You're totally
In respect,
right.
yeah.
I think you just, if you can, try to give people respect as a colleague, or courtesy as someone who, they're worthy of respect as a human being, but maybe they're not your kind of person. Maybe you're never going to have that kind of close relationship that you would with someone that you do have a connection with. And that doesn't mean you have to dislike them. You just say, this
Right.
person's doing their own thing and I'm doing my thing, and I'll just, treat them with respect and kind of let them do their own thing. If you're in a position of authority, if you're supervising them, that's a little bit different. I would highly recommend talking to a site supervisor or to your AmeriCorps program director, just to make sure that you're doing everything appropriately.
Right. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And if anybody else has any questions, I'm happy to stay on. I know I've been talking for an hour and 45 minutes now, so you're probably tired of it. But hopefully this has given you some things to think about. I'd like to think that this training, if you're like Carla and you've gone through it a few times, that's because hopefully it still has some value. It gives you some things you can think about in your daily life. Because like I said, there's no magic solution to this. At the end of the day, the way that we can act with less bias and more care is just by being intentional and by being self-aware. And that's an ongoing process. It's never going to be done. We're always working towards something without ever fully achieving it. And that's not a bad thing. That's just a human experience. So you shouldn't be too hard on yourself or get too burned out about that. It's a process where you need to take care of yourself so you can continue doing that type of personal work over time, because it's always going to be helpful. It's always going to be useful, whether or not you're 20, 50, or you're getting ready to die. Being a better person is always a good experience.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Andrew, for doing your training. We think, like you said, even if you're a returning member and you've participated in this training or you registered for it during launch, it's still very, very good to have multiple times. I think we're done. I will send out a recap email to everyone. I can include Andy's email address that he posted in the chat. If anyone has any questions that they would like to, reach out to him. I will also post the recording. And you guys have a great evening. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time and attention.
You're welcome.